Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my quicker standard review of the new Sigma 150-600mm, and this is an f5-6.3 variable aperture zoom lens. And so starting at f5 at 150mm, and then it stretches all the way out to 600mm, where the maximum aperture is f6.3. It is, according in Sigma speak, it is a DG lens, means it's designed for full frame. It is DN, designed for mirrorless. It has their OS or optical stabilizer built in, and it has their sport degree of build. Sigma has three different kind of build levels and designs: contemporary, art, and sport. And sport tends to receive, in some ways, the highest degree of build and certainly the highest degree of weather sealing, with the recognition that a sport type lens is going to be used for photographing sports, wildlife, kinds of things that typically are found outdoors. And so you need a very well weather sealed lens. Now, there was a 150-600mm lens that came out for Canon EF and Nikon F 6-7 years ago. And I reviewed that lens at that point, and I liked the lens optically, but one thing I did find is it was extremely heavy, and particularly heavy out towards the front. And so when you're supporting a long telephoto like this, if you have a lot of front weight, it just means that you're having to support it in the position of your body where it takes the most muscle to do so. The closer to your body, the easier it is to support that weight. Fortunately, this lens, they've managed to reduce the size somewhat and the weight significantly. And so the other lens was very close to 3 kilograms in weight. This lens is just right around 2.1 kilograms, 2,100 grams. So they've shaved a lot of weight off of it, and you can tell it's a much better balanced lens, much easier to use. Today's episode is brought to you by Ridge, the wallet redefined. Give your aching rear a break and ditch that bulky old wallet full of stuff you don't need and move to a sleek aluminum, titanium, carbon fiber, or even their new 18-karat gold Ridge wallet. It takes up little more room than a credit card, has RFID blocking technology to protect your valuable information, and comes with a lifetime warranty. Visit ridge.com/Dustin and use code Dustin to get 10% off your order, along with free shipping worldwide. So this lens joins the Sony 200-600mm G lens, the new Tamron 150-500mm lens, as kind of the current trifecta of ultra telephoto zoom lenses that are in the affordable category. Though the Sigma and the Tamron are more affordable than what the Sony is. The Sony being about $2,000 in the US market, and the Sigma coming in at about $1,400 US. Obviously that's going to vary a little bit depending on your market. Up and down on the price of either one of those lenses, but at least in the primary market that I'm evaluating, it is a significantly cheaper lens. It's also worth pointing out that this lens has the largest zoom ratio of any of these options. The Sony starts at 200mm. The Tamron ends at 500mm. The Sigma does all of the things. It goes from 150mm out to 600mm, giving you that 4 times zoom ratio, which is obviously very, very useful. So let's talk a little bit more about the build and the design of this lens. As noted, this has a very high degree of build. It's got a variety of premium materials in its design, including magnesium alloy, aluminum alloy, brass in the lens mount, and then also a few sections that have some high-end engineered plastics, thermal composites as Sigma calls them. But they've managed to put together a lens that is tough, but also obviously a little bit more lightweight, and that's going to be very appreciated out in the field. It's got weather sealing throughout the lens. Now, unlike the Sony is an internally zooming design, and so it's the largest of these 3 lenses, still by a good measure, about 54 millimeters longer than what the Sigma is. The Sigma comes in at about 268 millimeters, while the Sony is about 318 millimeters. And so it's about 54 millimeters the way it comes out to in terms of the difference. The weight is almost identical though between the lens. The Sony is 15 grams heavier, which you're not going to notice in the lens that is either 2100 or 2115 grams. But unlike the Sony, the Sigma does extend significantly when you're zooming it out, and in fact it actually ends up being longer than the Sony when fully zoomed out by about the same margin that it is shorter when it's fully retracted. Two different design philosophies, and obviously one will probably suit your purposes better than the other. There are some advantages to either one. The advantage for the Sigma is you'll be able to store this and carry it in some solutions that you can't fit the Sony in. The advantage for the Sony is that it is the smoother one to zoom in the field because all the zooming is in internal. And of course, many would argue that it has the potential for having better weather sealing because there's no moving parts in the exterior of the lens. And so maybe a little bit of an advantage there. Sony includes a nice lens hood that does have that transition area where you can reverse it and set it down like this, which is the most stable way to balance a lens like this. It also includes a nice padded case that does have straps on it to carry it as a means of transport. It has two different lens caps. There is a nylon option that can actually fit over the lens hood itself, if that's an option you want to go with, and they do include a traditional pinch cap in the box at 95 millimeters, which is the size of the front filter threads on the lens. The lens does have the AF hold button in 3 different positions, much like what the Sony lens does. Sigma's approach to zoom creep is that they have a new switch that has 3 different settings. And so in the kind of the smooth or release setting, you can see that the lens actually zooms very easily and will creep down very quickly on that. But it is going to be the easiest way to go in and out. And they've designed this to be either, twist or push-pull in terms of the way that it's going to be operated. The middle setting is T, which adds some tension to it, and so that means you can move it with more tension, but it also means you're going to be able to lock a position and not have as much issue with zoom creep. The final third position is a lock position, and that only works if you're at the 150 millimeter position. There are 4 other switches on here that deal with autofocus, manual focus switch, a focus limiter here, and 3 position setting for the optical stabilizer. And then there is a custom switch down below that. Though in this case, on Leica, you'll be able to, and by the way, this is sold in both Sony and Leica mounts. On the Leica, you have access to a USB dock where you can program other functionality to those custom buttons. Here on Sony, where I've tested it, it just gives you a couple of other options to control the behavior of the optical stabilizer that you can access in that. That optical stabilizer is rated at about 4 stops, and so similar to the other lenses that it's competing against, although I did find the Sony or the Sigma system here to be a Mannerly one, and I actually liked it a little bit better in operation than what I did the Tamron, and so kudos to them on that front. The tripod collar is rotatable, and it does have nice detents at the kind of the cardinal positions, 4 points of the compass, which is something that the Sony doesn't have. It also has an Arca Swiss compatible foot, which I really appreciate. Sony doesn't have. What it doesn't have that Tamron and Sony can do is that the tripod collar is not removable. On the Tamron, you can fully remove the tripod collar. On the Sony, you can remove the foot without tools. And so those, some give and take across those different platforms. But here we have a lens that operates, handles well, feels good in the hands, and has all of the various bits that you would be looking for in a premium type telephoto zoom like this lens. So let's talk about the autofocus for a moment here. This has a stepping motor and actuator that are a part of the focus system. And under normal shooting conditions, it is fast, it is silent, it is smooth in operation. It does a good job tracking my face as I approach the camera. And so for video work, you're going to get nice, smooth transitions. I also found that IAF worked well, whether I was working with a human subject or if I was working with an animal, in the case of Loki, our cat, or if I was working with birds. All 3 of those different, IAF options that I have on the Sony Alpha 1 that I tested this particular lens on. And so it worked well in all of those situations. And for most all types of work, I was very, very pleased. The reason why I say most all is that when I went on to test fast action, I did fine with bird in flight and I got fairly good tracking for that. But in the fast action sequences that I like to do where I have a dog charging towards the camera, I found that I didn't get nearly as good results as I do with the Sony 200-600. And the primary reason being is that the Sony autofocus just locks on, and as throughout that burst rate, you can get just beautifully focused results that you can just, freeze any one of those frames and it looks like it was just posed for that shot. On the Sigma, I found that very often focus was lagging just a little bit behind the place you want it on the eye of the subject. It would be more towards the rear paw, for example. And so they were never quite right there. Only occasionally did I get what I would consider an excellently focused result during my burst. Now, there is some possibility that Sigma would be able to improve this further via firmware in the future. I can only evaluate what I see, and right now there is a fairly large gap between the overall performance of the Sigma and the Sony lens. Your mileage may vary according to your technique and your subject, obviously, but you know, I have kind of a standard way that I evaluate these lenses, and I did this lens with the Sony side by side, and there was a notable result in keepers in that kind of scenario. So maybe something to consider if your photography includes a lot of high-speed action. If it doesn't, that's not really going to be a factor. In all other situations, I got very good focus results out of the Sigma. When it comes to the image quality breakdown, it's really quite spectacular how good these lenses have gotten. And this lens, if you look at the MTFs comparing this lens to the earlier Sigma 150-600 Sport, which I found to be the best of the bunch optically out of the 150-600mm variants from the previous generation. This new lens destroys it across the zoom range. It's just sharper throughout and more consistent into the corners. Very, very strong performance. And when it comes to evaluating it relative to the Sony and the Tamron, I would still say that the Sony, at least in the copies I'm evaluating, is ever so slightly better, a little bit more consistent, though there is some give and take there, as I noted. And the Tamron is right there basically with the Sigma. They're all very, very good optically, and so you're not going to be disappointed with the results you can get from this lens. It produces very good results. Distortion is relatively mild. Vignette is mild at 150 millimeters, a little bit more moderate at 600 millimeters, but easily correctable. No major issues there. Chromatic aberrations are well controlled. Flare resistance is good, and so a lot of strong performance across the frame there. And one significant advantage you've got here relative to the Sony is that you actually are able to have two different minimum focus distances, much like the Tamron is designed. In this case, though, your maximum magnification is going to be found at 180 millimeters, where you can get very close to your subject, and you can get an extremely high, highest in class, 0.34 times magnification. A very useful figure that basically allowed me to almost fill the frame with this little marigold blossom. And so that's a really impressive result and a significant advantage over the Sony, a mild advantage over the Tamron, just a percentage point or two, but certainly one over the Sony in that regard. Now, as I wrap up, however, there are two other considerations to have if you shoot with Sony's top bodies. At least one of these things is if you're shooting with Sony's top bodies, either the A9 or the Alpha 1. With the other bodies to this point who have less than a 15 frame per second burst rate, you won't notice any difference between the Sigma and the Sony lens. If you're shooting with the A9, for example, the cap is going to be at 15 frames per second, whether you're shooting an A9 or a Alpha 1 when it comes to the burst rate of the Sigma lens or any other third-party lens at this moment attached there. And so 15 frames per second, that means you're losing 5 frames per second on the Alpha 9 relative to the Sony lens. On the Alpha 1, you're losing 15 frames in performance. And so, you know, it's not to say that 15 frames per second isn't fast enough for most situations, but if you've bought an Alpha 1 in particular, you probably want to get those full 30 frames per second, and that might be a reason to consider the Sony instead. Another reason to consider the Sony is that Sony has limited the use of teleconverters to Sony lenses. And so while on Leica you can get a 1.4 times or 2 times teleconverter that can be used with this lens, on Sony you can only use the bare lens itself, whereas you can use Sony branded teleconverters on the Sony branded lenses. And so, you know, again, not a level playing field, not Sigma's fault, but it is the reality on the ground, so something worth considering. At the end of the day, though, this is a lot of lens for this price, and frankly, I was surprised at how aggressively Sigma priced it when you consider that the previous Sigma Sport, a lens that I would say is inferior to this one, at least in performance, came in at about $2,000 almost 7 years ago. This lens coming in at $1,400, you know, $600 cheaper for a better lens. I like that kind of math, and I suspect that you will too. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review. Also to an image gallery if you want to check out more photos. There are buying links down there if you'd like to put in a pre-order for one of these bad boys. However, if you're watching early on at release, some of the links may not be fully populated yet, so give them a little time for the various retailers to get that information up. They will populate though in time. You can also find linkage there to purchase some of my merchandise, to follow me on social media, become a patron, or to sign up for my newsletter. And if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Ring that bell so you get notifications when new content drops. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.